Welcome back to another episode of the Pax What She Said podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Perry Goldstein, joined as always by Maggie Loney. And this week, we're continuing our countdown to the draft. We are flipping it over to looking at defensive prospects that the Packers could go after on day one and beyond. But before we dive into it, hey Maggie, how you doing?
I'm good. It's kind of crazy that we're like 2 weeks away at this point from the draft. Next week, we'll have a special guest on, and then we'll do our live 7 round mock. And then it's draft week. At that point, we'll only have a couple days until the draft kicks off, and it's going to be a ton of fun to finally see who will put on some green and gold. So I love this time of year.
I know. It's so fun. So as per usual, the Packers get 30, all teams do get 30 visits, and most of them have been on the defensive side of the ball.
Yes.
So as we discussed in our last episode, visits have been kind of a nice indication of who they're going to pick. Sometimes later, not always in the first round, but there have been quite a few DBs, many DBs actually, in most recent, as well as some linebackers and defensive tackles. So we're going to start with defensive backs. There have been a number that have been mocked to the Packers. You and I have said we think that if there was something that the Packers were going to take in the first round, it's probably going to be corner. Do you still feel that way?
I don't know. I think it's tackle or DB.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. It's a good year to need a corner.
Mhm.
I feel like we say that every year, but it's a good year to need a corner. And I don't know. Where do you want to start? Because there are a few. I mean, there are a few that could go. I think that like depending on what they do will be based on like how early some of these corners go. There have been so many that have names that have been tied to the Packers, right? Obviously, Cooper DeJean, Iowa is like the name that most Packer fans want. I think his testing at his pro day might have put him out of reach unless the Packers want to trade up. We all know about one of the top corners in the draft, Nate Wiggins. The Packers just had Kool-Aid McKinstry come in. We know this because he posted the eclipse from his Instagram at Lambeau. So you can take this in any direction you want. But is there anyone you really like? Is there anyone that you would prefer that they go for? Are you pro for trade up, trade back?
I don't know, and I think it's really interesting too because, like, with Cooper DeJean being such an interesting prospect, it fully depends where the Packers envision him playing, and I think that's like a Jeff Hafley question. Like, do you want him to play safety? He can. Do you want him to run opposite Xavier McKinney? Sure. Do you like him more as a nickel? He can do that really seamlessly as well. Do you want to throw him out as a boundary corner? And if you do that, then who are you shifting inside? Is Jair going to play more nickel? Is it like so? I think there's a lot of layers to a pick like the Gene, and that makes it fun, right? Because you can
Mhm.
put them in a certain or a number of alignments, however you see them fitting. But yeah, he's certainly not like your traditional boundary corner that you would take like in the 20s. Whereas I think a guy like Quinion Mitchell, who probably is not going to be there for the Packers, is somebody that you would just throw on the boundary and you'd be like, yeah, we're fine. Like we're safe here. And what I thought was interesting, not to completely like jump out of the first round, but one of their top 30
Go for it.
visits was Jarian Jones, who is like a prototypical slot corner. I love him. I think he'd be such a good fit. And they've been doing their due diligence. They've got a ton of guys who can play safety or corner that they brought in. Omar Brown from Nebraska. Um, Tons of safeties on this list as well. Chris Edmonds was a safety at Arizona State, probably could play some corner, some nickel. So, yeah, it's just really interesting to see kind of like where the Packers are looking and do they go for traditional boundary because we think they're pretty set in Jair and in Valentine. And then you've got Stokes coming back, potentially see what he looks like going into his third year now that he's fully healthy. So I don't know. What do you think? Like, we always talk about boundary corner being such a premium position, and there's some really freaking good ones that'll be there for the Packers if they stick and pick. So I
Mhm.
don't know. It's tough this year.
It is tough this year. I think sticking and picking this year is not going to get them what they want if they want your one of the top guys.
Yeah.
I think they're going to have to move up. But again, to your point, if there are guys who might be there in the later rounds or they still have pick 40, it's 41,
Yep.
right? So they can package, they can move up if they want someone in the top of the second, right? So I don't know. I think they can move around, and I think given the talent that's going to be in like the top 50, um, there's also uh, Max Melton, Bo Melton's
Mm.
brother, who I know that they really liked and were eyeing at the combine, and he won't be a first round pick by any means. So um, I think you bring up a good point, which is where are they going to play this person? Are they going to play them? They don't they might not necessarily need a boundary corner. Do they want to go for the slot? Do they want to go for the guy who's going to play that more hybrid safety role? These are the questions we obviously don't have answers to.
Yeah. And I mean, I think to your point, like Max Melton, probably a late day two pick, could creep into the second, depending on how high teams value him. But like Andrew Phillips is another prospect who's like primarily a nickel, really physical press kind of player. Renardo Green, I've seen kind of mocked to the Packers on day two as another just
Mhm.
really physical press man corner. So I think that's kind of interesting too, right? As we have a tendency, or we've seen Goody take these really physical press man corners. Like that's his prototype. That's what he likes. And
Right.
we think Jeff Hafley's going to utilize that quite a bit. He talks about how much he likes press man and middle of the field closed and single high. So I think that'll go into it too, right? Like looking at where some of these guys are at their best.
Yeah.
And I just, there's it's a good year to invest at the position, even if some of these guys are potentially a little bit out of their thresholds. Like Kool-Aid McKinstry, I've seen people say that he just doesn't necessarily meet their like overall preferred athleticism for a corner. And I think that's probably true in some regards, but Jair was just kind of in their height threshold barely. And McKinstry, one of the things I keep seeing him described as is that he's almost more smart than a freak athlete. And when you're talking about being a corner in a defense, like I almost think I would prefer to have the incredibly smart player than the
Mhm.
freak athlete. So I'm just curious to see like how far we've seen them break their thresholds with like Jaden Reed last season. So I'm curious where they'll go if they'll reach for, a smaller prospect like the DB out of Michigan who's like 5'9", but a really, really freak athlete.
Yeah. Yeah. They have their freak athletes, right, on the back
Mhm.
end. So it's like, do they want someone with more of that smarts football IQ? Because communication was a problem the last few seasons. And so are they looking to plug the hole? And we can flip over to safety
Yeah.
because I think we're looking at this class more as like DBs,
Yeah.
right? Um, but we're looking, like I said, for someone to plug the holes in which like a Xavier McKinney doesn't fit. And so it's like do you necessarily need that freak athlete when you have a him and a Jair and even like a Carrington Valentine who was picked really because he just like fits that RAS threshold, right? Or would you rather have someone who, like I said, plugs the holes, has the football IQ? These are the questions because none of these safeties, at least that are going to be picked at the top of the draft, not that I think any of them are going to get taken in the first round, really are high freaky athletes, right? So to your point, is like, are you taking just a DB and then you're going to fit him? And Jeff Hafley is going to come in and say, all right, you played corner, we're going to move you, or are you taking a safety that is maybe not fitting some of your athletic thresholds, but is more a traditional safety and you don't have to move someone when they get to the NFL, which is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I think Tyler Nubbin is like the probably the most interesting case study for safety. He's probably the only safety that I think could go in the first round, like given where he's ranked. I've seen him falling all the way into the 50s, the first safety maybe not coming off until then, but I do think he'll be the first safety off the board. But he
Hmm.
had a 3.64 relative athletic score. So like good size, okay speed, poor
Yeah,
everything else. And that
not
just seems like
good.
right, that seems like something so anti-Packer, but when you watch him play, that's what matters. And I think
Right.
it's kind of like the Brian Branch argument from last year where it was like, well, he's not like an incredible athlete and where would you put him in? Like he's a football player and if you get good football players, that's what matters. So he'd to me be one of those players that would break the mold that the Packers historically set. Did you get a chance to watch Jaden Hicks?
I did. I love. But to your point, I feel the same way about Cameron Kitchens, which
Okay.
is like that dude was like my draft crush until he tested. And then I was like, all right, well, the Packers aren't going to take him because he tested super poorly. I mean, he tested a little bit better at his pro day, but then you watch his tape and it's like, damn, this guy can play. Like he's exactly the like I said, the opposite of a Xavier McKinney. He's a hard hitter. He's a much thicker safety, more of that box safety. I can just see him being more of that like Amos Savage, like that year where
Mhm.
they were just like that 2020 year. And I think you bring up Brian Branch as like just a perfect example of like, well, maybe these thresholds that they operate under aren't always perfect. Like maybe
Mhm.
they aren't always perfect predictors, because you watch a Cameron Kinchins, and if you don't follow, Ross Uglum has an awesome breakdown of him as a prospect. I mean, he's a wonderful player that would fill a lot of holes on the back end of this Packers defense. But the Packers have never taken a player. I think he's ranked here in the top 100 who tested as poorly as him. And so, like, okay, do you just want a football player or are you looking for the prime athlete?
And I think that's what's so like hit or miss about this safety class is there aren't too many
Yeah.
like prospects that have it all. Kalen Bullock out of USC. He's 6'2", not like your typical safety build. He's kind of light, only 188 pounds, which is historically too light for Green Bay's preferred metrics. Only 8 bench reps. Like, but he's 20. He's super young. And his nickname was Super Glue because
Hmm.
he never, would drop a ball. He used to play wide receiver, has taken a ton of snaps in the slot, played some in the box, played some deep. You can move him all around. So, like, some of the prospects that are coming out, they all have their pros and cons, and I don't think we're gonna have, like, the consensus number 1 safety in this class, but
Right.
there's some gems.
Yeah. I mean, Jaden Hicks is probably the only one, right, that tested with the high RAS score at 8.94.
Yeah, his was pretty high. There's some guys, like, tweeners, like, could potentially go undrafted, but late day 3 guys that tested pretty well, but again, those are normally your freaky athletes that you're taking a flyer on, which the Packers, they kinda, like, round out the room. So,
Hmm.
I don't know. One of my, sneaky favorites, and I don't really even know if it's sneaky at this point, is, Dadrian Taylor Demerson out of Texas Tech. I absolutely adore him, just, like, even from a personality standpoint, but he's so fun if you haven't watched him yet. He's got, like, this rangy kinda safety play where he can be in the slot, and he likes to bully, but he's got enough recovery speed to, like, make breaks on the ball even if he's nowhere near the play, and his nickname is Rabbit because he's just quick and athletic and agile, so he's a lot of fun. He was only a 2-year starter, but he had 7 interceptions, so
Okay.
kinda just always around the ball.
Well, we love that. We want playmakers also.
Exactly.
I think that's like key too. Something the Packers have been missing. All right, let's go to inside linebackers. Because I think this is a not sneaky need. Safety is not a sneaky need. Inside linebacker, not a sneaky need. Packers have basically two. They have Quay Walker and they have oh my god, I'm having a brain fart. Isaiah
Isaiah McDuffie.
McDuffie and Eric Wilson, who's basically just a special teamer. And that is all. So linebacker. They've had a few come in for, like I said, top 30 pick or top 30 visits. Ajarian Cooper from Texas A&M. Although I don't know if he's outside or inside. Inside, I
He's
think.
inside.
Yeah. Then they had Tyrone Hopper from Missouri. And Bryce Gallagher out of Northwestern is my list so far. Rumored Trevin Wallace from Kentucky as well, according to Acme Packing Company. So they're clearly looking at linebackers, as they should. It is a need. I don't know if there's necessarily a guy in the first round. I don't care really where they take someone, but they need to come out of this draft with someone.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, like, it could be a due diligence thing, but it also could be that they're actually considering taking someone early. Cooper's widely regarded as, like, the first or the best inside linebacker
Yeah.
in this class, and I don't think it would be a first-round pick at this point, but still, I mean, that is the thought. Up right up there with Peyton Wilson, excuse me, from North Carolina State. Those are probably your 2 best inside linebackers. The guys over at Packaday who love Trevin Wallace from Kentucky. Think he's going to go much higher. If you do mock drafts ever, he's always like a round 6, round 7 guy. I think he could go day 2. And you had mentioned him as a prospect that the Packers were looking at. I also, just because I have to, Kit Oladapo, the safety, I could see them going for like a big safety to kind of fill in opposite instead of getting like a traditional inside linebacker. Those hybrid players are really fun. But
He
yeah, I
also
mean,
came in for a top 30 visit.
yes, he did. I was very excited to see that. But yeah, I mean, like, it's absolutely a need. Wouldn't say it's like the strongest class,
Yeah.
to need one, but the Packers are always looking at rounding out their room. And I also think that there's a comfort in them starting with Isaiah McDuffie. Like, he was
Yeah.
with Jeff Hafley. They say all the right things about him, which you would expect them to do, right? It's coach speak, it's GM speak, but I don't necessarily think that they're coming in here looking for a starter. At least not.
But do you really feel comfortable with starting the year with Quay and Isaiah McDuffie?
Depending on how they're utilized. Like, I don't want Isaiah McDuffie in coverage, but if he's going to be like your thumper downhill linebacker, I'd probably be okay with it. I'm more concerned, I think, about both of them in obvious passing situations because we've seen Quay struggle with a little bit of that. Like, that's when I'd want like the hybrid safety to come in, like a
Right.
lighter box.
Because, like, you're one injury away from
Right,
a
no, yeah.
huge problem.
But
Like,
I
a
just don't see them
huge
investing
problem.
a day 1 or 2 pick at inside linebacker. Maybe they will, but they
It
so
makes me
undervalue the
really
position.
nervous. It
Yeah.
makes me really
Oh, I
nervous.
get it. But
Um, I mean, again, it can be mitigated with scheme and with investing in other positions, sure. But and again, we don't know the way Hafley is going to run this thing. So we're probably thinking in terms of like our old scheme.
right.
But as it stands right now, that room makes me nervous.
One inside linebacker, your dad will know this one. Maris Taliafu from Notre Dame. I was talking to Brennan Rupp about him on Twitter, like, early in the draft process, and he just looks like such a Packers inside linebacker. Not a great RAS, like, did not test very well, good size, not good explosion at all, but a pretty good coverage grade, taking snaps in the slot and in the box, and 6'2", 234 pounds, so kind of on the lighter side, but he thumps like the Packers would prefer it inside linebacker. So he's a name that I've been looking at as just somebody who I think is very Packers-esque on day
Yeah.
3.
Okay. We love it. Let's go to Edge because Edge is such an interesting one to me. One, they have not brought in a single Edge for a visit. Not really any kind of indication, but just an interesting factoid. Two, when you look at like value, like what the Packers value in the first round, like it's really like from the defensive side, it really historically has been corner and edge. They just took LVN. Do we think they do it again? I don't. I know that there's one guy you love, so I can let you talk about him. But I don't know. I mean, do they fill out that room depth-wise like later? Sure. But I just don't see this as something that they're going to invest heavily in early.
Yeah, I don't know. I do see, and maybe I think we're looking at different lists. This could be wrong, but I thought Austin Booker came in
Okay.
um as an edge rusher from Kansas State or from Kansas, but I maybe he didn't. But yeah, if so, there's only been the one. So definitely
Oh,
not a
it happened literally yesterday, so my list could be
okay.
updated.
That would make sense. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, I think there's certainly some guys that could slide, especially if we're talking about like all the offensive tackles and the wide receivers and the quarterbacks that are likely to go in the top 10, top 15. Like, I would just have a really hard time passing up on like a Latu at 25 if he slides all the way down there, or if he's sitting there at like
Yeah.
20 and you can trade up a little bit, give up like your second, third rounder or something to just go get a kind of impact player because I adore Preston Smith. He's probably on the tail end of his career.
Of course.
And then
Yeah.
at that point, it's Rashawn Gary and LVN who looked good, but you don't have any depth behind them at this point. So investing in a position that's always a premium, like if Jared Verse is there from Florida State, he potentially could be the first edge off the board. But if he slides, if Chop Robinson is sitting there, or even on like early day two, if they like him. Darius Robinson from Missouri, I think, is climbing. So there's a lot of players, or even like some day three guys, they're going to take at least one, if not two, just
Yes.
because. And maybe that's why Austin Booker came in, like
Right.
maybe he's a day or a round four kind of guy, or I guess potentially even day two that they really like. Marshawn Nealand is climbing quite a bit too from Western Michigan. So it's a good year again to need an edge rusher, but I feel like we say that every year. Like it's pretty easy to find some gems when you just tell
Mhm.
them, "Hey, go get the quarterback."
Yeah. Yeah. It's just interesting. Like, it's a position you always are like, yeah, if they take it, great. Like, I'm never going to be upset or not understand when a team invests in that level of like a blue chip player. It just will always make sense that you want someone to go hunt the quarterback. You want someone who's going to put pressure on the quarterback. Like, that is the name of the game. We literally watched as our star like went down with an ACL tear. Like, it can happen in an instant.
Yeah.
You mentioned it, Preston Smith, like they obviously are bringing him back, but he's probably on his last legs. They invested in LVN. We lost JJ Enigbare. It's just, you're going to fill out that room. It's just a matter of when and where. And again, I think you said it very well. There are talented players at every level of this draft. So it's really a matter of how the board falls and where they decide to invest. They're going to come out of this draft with an edge player, though. I mean, they just are.
Yeah. So this is where it gets interesting is to me is the defensive line because when we put like previewed our positions, you've got Kenny Clark, you've got Devontae Wyatt, you've got Colby Wooden, you've got Carl Brooks, you've got TJ Slayton. Like that's already five guys and they're pretty much all roster locks. Like that is a strong room. However, I would still love another defensive lineman. So like
Okay.
I mean, and how do you feel? Like do you think that's even something that they're considering or do you think like
Well, I know they brought in Christian Boyd from Northern Iowa. Um, they also brought in Michael Hall Jr. from Ohio State. Um, he's like a potential like top 100 pick, but he didn't test the combine. Um, See, this is the one room where I'm like, I think they could be okay. I think they could be okay. It'd be one of those things where it's again, if they want to invest in someone like they're really high on and fill that room out and just be really strong because and I don't want people to get mad, but like Kenny Clark, you don't know. Um he's coming up on a potential contract extension and or question mark.
Yeah.
save that for another day, right? I don't want what the Packers do at this position to have people think it's like any indication of that decision, right? Always thinking about the future, always trying to round out a room. However, like this room feels set for the first time in years. It
Probably
feels
ever.
set.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in living memory for me. So you don't go into the draft being like, we're drafting only for need, right? Of course not. But it's not a need. So it would feel luxurious if they
Yeah.
took someone top 50.
That said, if Ruka Rororo from Clemson is sitting there at 41, I don't care what what the rest of the room
Yeah.
looks like. I love him so
Do
much.
you? Is he your
Uh,
draft coach?
for the D line, yeah. Lance Zierlein comped him to Justin Madubuike, and we know how that turned out over in Baltimore. So, yeah, I just love him. Johnny Newton, of course, probably the only, well, probably not the only, but the consensus first D line off the board early in round one. I know that
Yeah.
like Jacob Westendorf, friend of the show, is big fan of Chris Jenkins because he's a Michigan player. Braden Fisk, I've seen from Florida State, mocked to the Packers quite a bit, just because he's one of those like bigger, more traditional B gap kind of players. But I don't know. I do think that they have what they need here, but
Right. I
I
mean, I don't know
it's hard to.
if Byron Murphy starts sliding. I mean, like, I don't know.
There you go. Exactly.
Like, I don't know.
And he could.
Yeah,
So
he could because again, if quarterbacks, cornerbacks, wide receivers, offensive tackles, all of a sudden you're looking at like some of these guys 100% being there and being available. I just don't know where the Packers are valuing the D line at the moment. Like we said, given where the room is.
yeah. And I mean I think you said it best when you said it would be a luxury pick because it would certainly be a pick that they don't necessarily need to make. But when you think about like what a really incredibly stout defensive front can do to just alter a game, and again, I think a lot of this comes down to Jeff Hafley and what he's thinking and where he's envisioning guys. Like we've talked about the possibility of like Rashawn Gary kind of playing roaming nose or Preston Smith or some of these guys like either kicking out and rushing off the edge or lining up more over the middle, like behind TJ Slayton. So there's a lot of versatility and variability in what Jeff Hafley wants to do. And I think that also matters for like inside linebackers. Like he probably wants a coverage linebacker and a downhill thumper. Like he has different roles that he'll envision
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of these guys. So depending on what edge rushers are there, what linemen are there, like it all could look different.
Yeah. All right. Any closing thoughts?
I don't know. I think that we shouldn't be surprised when they go for the traditional picks that they historically make in the first couple rounds, right? Like if it's an edge rusher, I'm not going to be shocked. If it's a corner, I'm not going to be shocked. I don't really think there's any position that's going to shock me in the first in the entire draft, honestly, really. Like I expect them to take a quarterback on day 3 unless they take like a kicker. Maybe that might surprise me a little bit, but
Yeah. I mean, given the current kicker situation, yes.
well, they did bring in Greg Joseph
That's
and
what I mean. Like
yeah, so that
they've
would be
got the
weird.
competition going.
But yeah, no, I'm just excited. I just want to see who these Packers are going to be.
I agree with you. I think that's still going to be a heavy defensive draft. I think the Packers offense is in a really good place. I think the pieces for the new defensive coordinator are going to be key here. So don't be surprised if the Packers continue to invest in defense as they always do. It's my hunch about it. But I guess that is all from us, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did it. We'll be back. What's next week? Our mock?
No, next week is our special guest.
Next week is our special guest. Thank you, Maggie, for keeping me on track. Next week we'll have a special guest to talk about the big board, and then we will do our mock. This is gonna be great. Thank you so much for joining us for talking defensive prospects. Let us know in the comments what you think, who you like, who your draft crushes are.
Yeah,
We
for
want to
sure.
hear it all. You can follow us on Twitter at PWSS Podcast. You can follow Maggie at Maggie J. Loney. You can follow me at Perry_Goldstein. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Download wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate you. Yeah, and as always, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.